Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Such gestures, simple as they seem, help us anchor ourselves in the present, though what follows will quietly dismantle the comfort of believing that the present is any kind of refuge. Tonight, we turn our attention to Nyarlathotep, the only god in Lovecraft's vast pantheon, who walks among us in disguise, a figure whose familiarity is more terrifying than any alien monstrosity. It is not merely a creature of nightmare, nor an invention of pulp imagination. It is rather a philosophical instrument, a mirror polished so darkly that one sees the universe itself looking back. When H.P. Lovecraft conceived Nyarlathotep in 1919, he was responding to an age that worshipped progress while teetering on the brink of dissolution. The Great War had just ended, empires were collapsing, and the dream of reason was beginning to curdle into mechanized horror. Lovecraft's creation emerged not as a fantasy, but as a diagnosis, a messenger of truth in a civilization built on comforting lies. Nyarlathotep's genius lies in its method: communication rather than destruction, revelation rather than chaos. We must recognize that studying this entity is an act of contamination. To understand it is to invite it, to let its whisper thread through the mind's quieter rooms. Over the next 4 parts, we will trace its origins, examine its philosophy, follow its literary evolution, and confront its lingering shadow in our culture. Consider this carefully. Some ideas do not need to be believed to be dangerous. They only need to be understood. We must begin, as all things do, with context. When H.P. Lovecraft penned Nyarlathotep in late 1919, the world was in the throes of a spiritual concussion. The First World War had ended just a year prior, leaving behind a psychic landscape scorched not only by the horrors of mechanized warfare, but by a sense that rationality itself had failed. The Enlightenment project, so long championed as the triumph of reason, science, and human progress, had, it seemed, delivered only trenches, mustard gas, and mass death. Against this bleak tableau, Lovecraft wrote of a figure who embodies not destruction, but demonstration, not conquest, but corruption through knowledge. Nyarlathotep emerges not as a monster in the traditional sense, but as a walking contradiction, a deity who communicates clearly, rationally, even charismatically, yet whose very words undo the minds of his listeners. It is not simply a being of horror, it is the horror of being shown. Lovecraft's own life at this time mirrored the larger cultural unease. His letters reveal a man increasingly disillusioned with modern society, disturbed by industrialization, and skeptical of both democracy and the masses. In his December 1921 correspondence with Reinhard Kleiner, Lovecraft refers to Nyarlathotep as emerging from a vivid dream, one that affected me, enough to make me write a poem. This admission is more than anecdotal. It situates the god's origins within the blurred boundary between sleep and waking thought, between unconscious dread and conscious articulation. It is not coincidental that Nyarlathotep's first literary appearance was in a prose poem rather than a full story. The form itself resists narrative closure, just as the god resists narrative containment. He does not belong to a tale. He is the disruption of tale-making itself. In Nyarlathotep, 1920, the titular figure arrives not in a ruined temple or alien dimension, but in the center of the modern world, in cities, on stages, through demonstrations of inexplicable science. This setting marks a profound departure from traditional horror, which had long relied on remote castles or dark forests. Nyarlathotep walks through Boston, San Francisco, and unnamed metropolises, clothed in the language of scientific advancement. The poem's speaker remarks on strange instruments and silent displays that evoke awe and despair. There are no screams, only the quiet crumbling of certainty. This reveals something profound. Lovecraft understood that, in the modern world, the greatest terror would not come from outside civilization, but from within its proudest achievements. The god's terror is not cloaked in shadows, but illuminated by electric light. He is not an intruder, but a demonstrator, a being whose tools are indistinguishable from the miracles of progress. We must recognize the irony. In an age intoxicated by rationalism, Lovecraft invented a figure who uses rational means to expose the futility of reason itself. This is not simple anti-modernism. It is a deeper, more insidious philosophical critique. Nyarlathotep does not destroy minds with spells or incantations. He shows audiences something they cannot refute, something that displaces all prior knowledge. Here, Lovecraft anticipates a key motif of postmodern horror, the epistemic rupture, wherein the very tools used to construct understanding become agents of its collapse. Consider carefully how prescient this is. Decades before Derrida, Foucault, or Baudrillard, Lovecraft had already suggested that the production of knowledge is not inherently safe, and may, in fact, be the most dangerous act of all. It is not simply that Nyarlathotep brings destruction. He brings clarity, and in doing so, annihilates illusion. In this, he differs radically from the other entities populating Lovecraft's mythos. Cthulhu sleeps, Azathoth gibbers, Shub-Niggurath spawns, but Nyarlathotep walks, speaks, and demonstrates. He does not slumber in deep time. He moves through human culture. He is not a metaphor for unconscious dread, but a force of conscious undoing. He is, in a phrase, the Enlightenment's unholy child, the one who takes its logic to its most horrifying conclusion. Not ignorance, but knowledge itself becomes the abyss. And what is more, he makes no effort to conceal this. His message is not coded, nor hidden. He tells the truth, and the truth kills. This raises a troubling question. Why would Lovecraft, a man so enthralled by science and ancient knowledge, invent a god who weaponizes both? The answer lies in the paradox at the heart of his worldview. Lovecraft revered the rational mind, yet he feared what that mind might uncover. In his letters, he often described himself as a mechanistic materialist, yet his fiction is obsessed with the consequences of confronting a cosmos devoid of meaning. Nyarlathotep becomes the figure through which this tension is expressed. Not resolved, but given narrative form. He is not merely a creation of dread. He is dread made elegant, dread made mobile, dread that wears a smile. In this way, Lovecraft's God is not an escape from modern anxieties, but their personification. He exists because we needed him to. By situating Nyarlathotep within urban landscapes and giving him the power of language, Lovecraft ensured that this figure would not be confined to the mythic past or alien future. He walks now, he speaks now, and this temporal immediacy forms the basis for the god's terrifying endurance. We may forget the hierarchies of elder beings or the rituals of ancient cults, but we remember the man in the crowd whose words made the world shimmer and break. In a century defined by propaganda, spectacle, and media saturation, Nyarlathotep appears less as a monster and more as a warning we failed to heed. To understand Nyarlathotep not merely as a literary invention, but as a reconfiguration of much older motifs, we must begin by surveying the fragmented landscape of ancient mythologies and philosophical crises that prefigure his arrival. It is not sufficient to say that Lovecraft created this god. More accurately, he unearthed and reassembled a pattern, one that had long whispered through the collective unconscious in the guise of trickster deities, divine messengers, and apocalyptic heralds. Nyarlathotep echoes the gait of the Egyptian god Thoth, the duplicity of Set, and the ambivalence of Hermes Trismegistus. Yet unlike these figures, who often operate within ordered cosmologies, Lovecraft's emissary functions in the absence of cosmic structure. His message is not that order has been disrupted, but that it never existed at all. This distinction is crucial. Nyarlathotep does not announce the end of the world. He informs us that it was always ending, and we were too dazzled by progress to notice. Consider the Egyptian overtones of Nyarlathotep's earliest manifestation, the Black Pharaoh who walks among the people, inspiring awe and fear through impossible demonstrations. This figure does not emerge from a Western pantheon, but is adorned with symbols from a civilization long associated with sacred knowledge, hidden rites, and monumental silence. Egypt, as imagined through 19th and early 20th century Orientalism, represented both antiquity and unknowability. Lovecraft, ever the antiquarian, exploits this imagined ambiguity, not to romanticize it, but to destabilize the very act of looking backward for meaning. In Nyarlathotep's Egyptianism, we do not find mystical reassurance, but the first sign of danger, that perhaps all ancient knowledge, if truly decoded, would reveal not eternal wisdom, but a silence so vast it unmakes the mind. This is not nostalgia. It is epistemological vertigo disguised as historical inquiry. We must pause here to consider the philosophical climate of Lovecraft's era, particularly the echoes of late 19th century pessimism. Arthur Schopenhauer's assertion that the world is driven by a blind, insatiable will finds dark resonance in Lovecraft's portrayal of the cosmos, not as evil, but as indifferent in a manner beyond comprehension. Friedrich Nietzsche, too, casts his shadow across Nyarlathotep's visage. Where Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God and warned of the abyss that follows, Lovecraft answered with a figure who is the abyss, yet walks, speaks, and wears a human face. It is not simply that Nyarlathotep heralds meaninglessness, he performs it. In this way, Lovecraft's creation becomes a dramatization of post-Enlightenment despair. No longer content with intellectual abstraction, the collapse of metaphysical certainty is embodied in a figure who demands your attention and then destroys your ability to interpret what you've seen. Nyarlathotep also inherits the ancient tradition of the trickster, but here, the transformation is almost surgical. In many mythologies, the Norse Loki, the Yoruba Ashu, the Native American coyote, the trickster is not evil, but ambiguous, a necessary disturber of order who renews the world through mischief, paradox, and transgression. Yet Lovecraft's iteration lacks the regenerative function of these earlier figures. Nyarlathotep does not clear the ground for renewal. He leaves only ruin. This reveals something profound. The trickster has been severed from the sacred cycle. In modernity, there is no return to balance, only the illusion of motion. Nyarlathotep is not simply mischief. He is entropy masquerading as revelation. It is not playfulness, but parody. A cruel echo of humanity's former myths, devoid of all redemptive structure. We must also account for the influence of occult revival movements, particularly theosophy and the broader spiritualist culture of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Figures like Helena Blavatsky popularized the idea of ascended masters and hidden spiritual hierarchies operating behind the facade of material reality. Lovecraft, who frequently mocked such movements in his letters, nevertheless seems to absorb their structures only to invert them. Where Blavatsky imagined beings of light guiding humanity toward enlightenment, Lovecraft gives us a being of darkness, yet one who tells the truth. In this way, Nyarlathotep becomes the anti-theosophical master, offering not transcendence, but the final dismantling of all belief. He is not the gatekeeper to a higher plane. He is the voice whispering that the gate was never there, and that the map you followed was written in your own blood by hands you never noticed shaking. Rhetorically, Nyarlathotep mirrors the ancient role of the prophet, particularly those found in apocalyptic literature. In the book of Revelation, the divine messenger John receives visions too vast for language, images that fracture human categories and foretell the end. Similarly, Nyarlathotep speaks in riddles and demonstrations, inducing visions in those who witness his arrival. But unlike biblical prophets who serve divine justice, Nyarlathotep serves no moral order. His revelations are not about salvation or judgment, but annihilation without narrative. This distinction separates him from religious prophecy and places him within a secular nihilism that is far more difficult to resist. It is not fire and brimstone he promises, but the quiet implosion of all meaning. He is not a prophet of the end. He is the end of prophecy. And yet, despite these myriad precursors, Nyarlathotep is not reducible to any one of them. He is not merely a god, nor a demon, nor a cosmic archetype. He is the residue left when all categories fail, the walking remainder of systems that once tried to explain the universe and now lie shattered. His speech is composed of fragments, of Egypt and science, of myth and madness, of apocalypse and demonstration. In this, he becomes a uniquely modern god, one built not of belief, but of collapse. As such, he cannot be banished, because he was never truly summoned. He has always been among us, wearing the face of whatever system we most trust. To name something is to imply its knowability, its categorization, its containment within the symbolic architecture of human understanding. But what then are we to make of a name like Nyarlathotep? It neither translates nor invites translation. It suggests a language without root, a syllabic sequence that evokes ancient resonance without offering etymological anchor. It is not simply a made-up word. It is a constructed rupture, a sound that destabilizes, a name that mimics ancient authority while offering none of its assurance. According to Lovecraft, the name came to him in a dream, unbidden and unanalyzed. This origin alone makes it suspect. Not inspiration, but intrusion. Not invention, but invasion. We must recognize that even at the level of phonetics, Nyarlathotep functions as a linguistic anomaly, a parasite within speech itself. We might be tempted to trace the name to ancient Egyptian roots, and many have tried. Hotep is reminiscent of names like Imhotep, suggesting peace or satisfaction in ancient Egyptian. But this fragmentary link only deepens the dissonance. For what precisely would Nyarlathotep mean? The peace of Nyarlath? And who or what is Nyarlath? The name teases meaning but denies it. This is not coincidence, it is strategy. Lovecraft understood the power of ancient-sounding words not because of their definitions, but because of their atmospheres. Like Necronomicon or Ar-Lieh, Nyarlathotep evokes a cultural memory of knowledge without origin, books without authors, gods without myths. It is not a name meant to be spoken. It is a cipher that resists decoding, and in resisting, it enacts precisely what the god it signifies represents: the failure of language in the face of the real. This destabilizing function extends beyond the name to the language that surrounds Nyarlathotep in Lovecraft's texts. His appearances are described not with monstrous adjectives, but with terms that resist categorization. He is called the crawling chaos, a phrase which, while poetic, is functionally oxymoronic. Chaos does not crawl. Crawling implies direction, intention, embodiment. Chaos is supposed to be formless, directionless, sprawling. And yet Lovecraft insists on this contradiction. He crawls. The phrase thus becomes an act of conceptual violence, forcing the ineffable into grotesque locomotion. It is not simply descriptive, it is symbolic sabotage. Lovecraft doesn't just tell us Nyarlathotep is beyond understanding. He uses language itself to perform that disintegration. The sentence structure buckles under the weight of the entity it tries to contain. We must pause here to consider the role of language as threshold, and how Lovecraft turns that threshold into a trap. In traditional horror, language names the horror. It allows it to be warned against, warded off, or contextualized within narrative. But Nyarlathotep undoes this function. His name does not protect, it contaminates. In The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, the character Akeley writes letters whose syntax becomes increasingly strange, mechanical, and alien. In The Haunter of the Dark, 1936, the incantation Nyarlathotep itself becomes a medium of summoning, not through faith, but through phonetic recognition. Here, we see a deeper implication, that to speak the name is to enter a semiotic spiral, where words no longer signify safety or knowledge, but become vectors of unmaking. It is not a name, but a trigger, not an identifier, but a viral utterance. In this context, we can read Nyarlathotep through the lens of semiotics and post-structuralist theory. Jacques Derrida, writing decades later, would argue that meaning is always deferred, never fully present. Every word points to another word, never to the thing itself. Lovecraft, whether knowingly or not, dramatizes this principle with uncanny precision. Nyarlathotep is the word that breaks this chain, not by offering the final signifier, but by breaking the possibility of signification altogether. It is not simply that his name is hard to pronounce or spell. It is that pronunciation and spelling themselves become absurd in his presence. Language is shown to be arbitrary, hollow, performative. The narrator in Nyarlathotep reports that crowds watched in silence, and none could explain what we had seen. This is not metaphor, it is diagnosis. Moreover, the name's musicality, its rhythm, its foreign cadence, operates like a ritual chant, one that lingers in the mouth and mind. Lovecraft was obsessed with the idea of names as keys, not keys to power, as in magical incantation, but keys to collapse. His mythos is full of such names: Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Desathogwa, all of them sonically jarring, alien in their structure, yet familiar enough to be spoken. But Nyarlathotep is singular in this regard. It is not simply alien, it is seductive. It tempts the tongue, it begs to be said. And that temptation is part of the horror. We do not scream his name in terror, we recite it as if in awe. This reveals something unsettling, that even in the act of analysis, even now, we participate in his invocation. Consider carefully the cultural implications of a name that spreads without meaning. In an age of memes, algorithms, and information loops, Nyarlathotep becomes a proto-mimetic entity. He survives not through belief or worship, but through repetition, through his name's capacity to endure without context. In this way, the name Nyarlathotep predicts a world where language is no longer used to discover truth, but to disrupt cognition. He is not the god of lies. He is the god of noise. He is not misinformation. He is pure, unfiltered signal, so overwhelming that interpretation itself ceases to function. If Nyarlathotep is, as we have argued, a destabilizing force whose very name fractures meaning and whose voice dismantles cognition, then the question arises: how does Lovecraft successfully build a myth around such a figure? Myth, after all, is traditionally a system of stories designed to stabilize, offering cosmologies, origins, and lessons meant to endure. Nyarlathotep, by contrast, appears to mock the very structure of storytelling. And yet, paradoxically, he is among the most compelling and pervasive figures in the entire Cthulhu mythos. We must recognize that Lovecraft achieves this effect through strategic mythopoesis, that is, by deliberately blurring the boundaries between history and hallucination, dream and document, folklore and fiction. In doing so, he crafts not a linear narrative, but a fragmented archive, one that mimics the organic growth of real religious or folkloric traditions. Nyarlathotep's mythic believability begins with placement. He is not introduced in an exotic or distant locale, but within the recognizable structures of early 20th century civilization: scientific lectures, urban centers, letters between educated men. Consider his debut in the prose poem Nyarlathotep, 1920, where the narrator walks among crowds in cities that resemble our own, witnessing bizarre demonstrations of science that no one can explain. The tone is not mystical, but empirical. There are no ancient cults, no esoterics, Morris diagrams, only the slow realization that the miracle of technology has inverted into something unknowable. This setting functions like a trap. By grounding Nyarlathotep in the real, Lovecraft seduces the reader into believing his unreality might also be real. This is not the distant awe of mythic time. It is the creeping horror of now. From a structural perspective, Lovecraft's method mirrors what folklorists call narrative layering, embedding fragments of a myth within multiple textual formats: letters, newspaper clippings, secondhand testimonies, dreams. In stories like The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath and The Haunter of the Dark, Nyarlathotep appears obliquely through visions, rumors, or artifacts like the Shining Trapezohedron. These are not full expositions, but glimpses, scraps of a puzzle never intended to be completed. This technique simulates the way ancient myths evolve, not from single authorship, but through collective transmission, reinterpretation, and loss. Lovecraft does not give us Nyarlathotep's origin story. He gives us symptoms of his presence. In doing so, he mimics the archaeological feel of discovering an old religion, one whose practices are half-remembered and whose theology has rotted away, leaving only terrifying fragments. Crucially, Nyarlathotep's myth is authenticated not by belief, but by consistency across unreliability. In Lovecraft's mythos, no narrator is ever fully reliable, and no perspective ever total. Yet Nyarlathotep's characteristics, his multiplicity of forms, his articulate cruelty, his role as messenger of chaos, remain disturbingly stable across decades of stories and authors. This paradoxical stability and contradiction reinforces his credibility. He is known not because we see him clearly, but because his absence of coherence is always the same. Consider this carefully. It is not clarity that makes a myth endure, but recurrence. The more times a story about Nyarlathotep unfolds without resolution, the more real he becomes, not as a character, but as an inevitability. He is not explained. He accumulates. We must also address the role of dreams in this myth-making enterprise. Unlike most gods, Nyarlathotep does not appear primarily through ritual or revelation, but through dreams, specifically, the dreams of those who consider themselves rational. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, he guides Randolph Carter not as a savior or antagonist, but as an intermediary between dream and reality. This positioning transforms him into a liminal figure, not unlike Hermes in Greek myth, or the trickster deities of indigenous traditions. Yet, unlike those figures, Nyarlathotep offers no path back to wholeness. The dream is not a metaphor, it is a domain, and within it, logic does not apply. This use of dreams as narrative space further detaches his myth from classical structure. It becomes a tapestry without borders, one that leaks into waking life through implication and suggestion. Moreover, Lovecraft's careful use of pseudo-documentary language lends additional weight to Nyarlathotep's mythic authenticity. The Whisperer in Darkness and the Haunter of the Dark, for example, Lovecraft writes through the conventions of scholarly investigation, archival notes, journal entries, first-hand observations. These formats create an illusion of objectivity, even as the content unravels into madness. By embedding Nyarlathotep within texts that imitate academic rigor, Lovecraft reverses the reader's defenses. It is not the supernatural that violates the real, but the real that gradually mutates into the unthinkable. In this way, the very instruments of knowledge, books, letters, diagrams, become vectors of myth. The more we try to document him, the deeper we sink into his narrative gravitational field. Finally, we must examine the philosophical implications of building a myth that resists its own coherence. Traditional myths offer explanations. They situate humanity within a cosmos governed by cycles, laws, or divine narratives. But the myth of Nyarlathotep offers no such reassurance. His role is not to explain, but to reveal the impossibility of explanation. He is myth as anti-myth, a story that tells us stories are lies. And yet, in telling that story again and again, Lovecraft creates a new kind of mythology, one in which belief is replaced by suspicion, awe by dread, structure by recursion. Nyarlathotep becomes the god of unfinished narratives, of half-glimpsed truths, of mythic authority without mythic comfort. In Lovecraft's universe, terror does not arise from death, pain, or even monstrosity. It arises from the recognition of one's irrelevance. This is the foundational engine of cosmic horror, and Nyarlathotep is its most articulate expression. While entities like Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth represent the vast, insensible chaos of the universe, they remain distant, passive, dormant. Nyarlathotep walks. He speaks. And in speaking he articulates, not comfort, not judgment, but the unflinching truth of human insignificance. His arrival does not signal apocalypse in the biblical sense. Rather, it exposes that apocalypse is simply the natural state of things, and always has been. We must recognize that his terror lies not in the unknown, but in the unavoidable. He does not kill, he awakens. And those who awaken never sleep again. The first and most consistent philosophical theme embodied by Nyarlathotep is that of cosmic insignificance. In his original 1920 prose poem, the narrator recounts that after witnessing Nyarlathotep's demonstrations, we saw the world battling against blackness, against the waves of destruction from ultimate space. Note that it is not Nyarlathotep who destroys, it is truth that does. He is merely the conduit through which the unbearable is made visible. This aligns with Lovecraft's larger worldview, often articulated in his letters. The human race is a negligible incident in a remote corner of space. The horror, then, is not that we are threatened by gods, it is that we are noticed by one, and that he confirms everything we secretly feared about our fragility. In this schema, Nyarlathotep is not evil, he is confirmation. But if insignificance is the emotional cornerstone of Lovecraft's horror, then entropy is its philosophical architecture. Nyarlathotep does not merely represent decay, he is a personification of the active unraveling of order. This is why Lovecraft calls him the crawling chaos, a phrase that should not be dismissed as mere poetry. Chaos in Lovecraft's usage is not violent randomness. It is the cold, unstoppable dissolution of structure. Consider how Nyarlathotep moves through civilization, not with armies or fire, but with demonstrations, processions, and revelations. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, he manipulates Carter through layers of dream logic, dissolving space, time, and identity, until the dreamer no longer knows whether he exists at all. This is entropy-made narrative. Things do not explode. They unfold, slowly, quietly, until the floor beneath your reality simply stops being there. It is not destruction that terrifies in these encounters. It is the loss of frame. Every principle, time, selfhood, memory, place, becomes unstable in the presence of Nyarlathotep. This links directly to a third core theme, the dream-reality continuum. Lovecraft's use of dream logic is not decorative. It is methodological. In his stories, dreams do not reveal hidden truths. They are the truths because waking reality is itself an illusion of structure. Nyarlathotep appears most frequently in dreams, not because he is a figment, but because the dream state is the only space where his truth can be felt. In The Dreams in the Witch House, we see mathematics, folklore, and subconscious terror collide in Walter Gilman's descent into warped space-time, an environment where Nyarlathotep's emissaries roam freely. The implication is unnerving. To dream of him is not to hallucinate. It is to intersect with the deeper strata of reality, the one from which waking life is merely a fleeting surface film. We must pause here and ask, why does Lovecraft so insist on dreams as vectors for revelation? The answer lies not in psychology, but in epistemology. Dreams, unlike reason, do not require consistency. They allow contradiction, simultaneity, and disjunction, conditions that mirror Lovecraft's cosmic horror more faithfully than logic ever could. Nyarlathotep thus becomes a kind of philosophical parasite, one that thrives in the cracks between waking and sleeping, between sanity and madness, between the laws we accept and the truths we cannot endure. He is not the god of dreams. He is the god of what dreams expose, namely, that the structures we rely on are provisional at best and delusional at worst. This reveals something profound. Dreams are not escapes in Lovecraft's universe. They are entries, pathways to recognition, and therefore, to collapse. The final implication of these philosophical themes is perhaps the most devastating. Nyarlathotep, unlike any other cosmic being in Lovecraft's pantheon, makes the horror personal. He addresses humanity. He talks. He chooses to appear not as a tentacled monstrosity, but as a man, articulate, mesmerizing, even beautiful. This anthropomorphic presentation does not humanize him. It weaponizes our identification. In speaking to us in our own language, wearing a face we can comprehend, he ensures that the philosophical truths he reveals cannot be deflected as foreign. When he shows us our insignificance, we must accept it. When he demonstrates entropy, we must watch. When he whispers that dreams are more real than waking, we must dream again, and know it. In this way, he collapses the distance between cosmic and intimate. The universe does not merely forget us. It tells us why we do not matter. When one speaks of Nyarlathotep, one cannot do so in isolation, for he exists not as a lone deity, but as the conscious nerve of a larger, incomprehensible body, the outer gods. These entities, faceless and voiceless, reside at the black center of infinity, where chaos hums without pattern or pause. They are Azathoth, the blind idiot god, Yog-Sothoth, the key and the gate, and Shub-Niggurath, the unending fecundity of matter. Each embodies a principle that transcends moral language. Azathoth as mindless creation, Yog-Sothoth as total knowledge, and Shub-Niggurath as endless production. But none of these forces communicate. They are pure function, cosmic verbs without subject or intent. Nyarlathotep is their syntax, the structure through which the ineffable becomes articulate. He is not the son of gods, but their translation, an emissary of madness who alone understands that communication itself is the cruelest act. Lovecraft's letters often frame the universe as a system without teleology, yet his fiction gives it the illusion of hierarchy. At the top sits Azathoth, the lord of all things, writhing to the monotonous piping of demonic flutes. But this lord knows nothing of rule. It is Nyarlathotep who enforces, interprets, and corrupts. He alone moves through the layers of existence, dream, matter, consciousness, without distortion. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, he stands before Randolph Carter not as an adversary, but as an interlocutor, explaining that the gods of Earth are mere dreams within his keeping. It is not domination he represents, but mediation, the living conduit between human perception and cosmic indifference. In this sense, Nyarlathotep is the universe become legible, the abyss given grammar, and yet The price of understanding him is annihilation. The moment the chaos speaks, it becomes unbearable. Consider this carefully. Nyarlathotep's uniqueness lies in his mobility. Where the other outer gods are static, bound to dimensions of incomprehensible space, he traverses all realms freely. He moves through the cosmos, through dreams, and, most disquietingly, through human society. In the prose poem Nyarlathotep, he appears as a dark wanderer who brings strange devices and demonstrates impossible sciences to crowds of eager spectators. The audience's fascination soon decays into horror, but not because they see monstrosity. Rather, they witness truth stripped of its human frame. The demonstration is never described in detail because it cannot be. The event's horror lies in its epistemic consequence. Lovecraft thereby turns the mythic messenger into a modern prophet, a scientist priest who delivers revelation as experiment. It is not sorcery that binds him to us. It is curiosity. He is not the god of superstition. He is the god of demonstration. To grasp the scale of his influence, we must also examine his relationship to the great old ones, the sleeping titans like Cthulhu and Dagon, who inhabit Lovecraft's mythic earth. While the great old ones dream in alien geometries, Nyarlathotep remains awake. He speaks on their behalf when they cannot, stirring cults and whispering doctrines that prepare humanity for their return. Yet he is not servant in the conventional sense. In The Whisperer in Darkness, hints suggest that Nyarlathotep manipulates even his masters, spreading their infection more efficiently than their own awakening could. He is the viral logic of chaos, both medium and message, both priest and parasite. Where the others embody terror, he embodies its dissemination. His very existence collapses the distinction between revelation and contagion, between theology and transmission. He is not the storm, but the whisper before it, a sound so low that one mistakes it for thought. What separates Nyarlathotep from both gods and men is intention. The other outer gods act without will. They are forces, not personalities. Nyarlathotep, by contrast, chooses. He delights in deception, irony, and the slow dismantling of human understanding. In The Dreams in the Witch House, he appears as the Black Man, a figure who offers forbidden knowledge under the guise of mentorship. The pact is never explicitly demonic. It is intellectual. He offers Gilman the thrill of mathematical revelation, and in return, takes from him the possibility of coherent thought. This motif recurs across Lovecraft's corpus, Nyarlathotep, as teacher whose lesson is fatal. He gives humanity what it claims to desire, truth, and thereby proves that desire itself was a form of self-destruction. It is not malice that drives him, but amusement. He plays with minds as one might play with mirrors, watching reflection become fracture. We must also recognize that his multiplicity of forms is not a theatrical flourish, but a metaphysical statement. Lovecraft writes that Nyarlathotep possesses 1,000 forms and 1,000 names. This is not hyperbole, it is ontology. His identity is inherently unstable, suggesting that coherence itself is a human imposition on a universe that has none. One moment he is the Black Pharaoh, another the faceless messenger, another an amorphous chaos. Each form reveals a facet of humanity's attempt to make sense of disorder, and each, in turn, fails. The multiplicity is not disguise, it is essence. Nyarlathotep does not hide his true face. He has no face to hide. Like language itself, he is infinite in variation and empty at the core. To perceive one of his guises is to glimpse the recursive logic of entropy, the realization that identity, whether divine or mortal, is an illusion born of our need for order. And yet, for all his vastness, Nyarlathotep remains profoundly intimate. Unlike the unreachable horrors of cosmic space, he operates on the scale of the personal. He whispers, he instructs, he walks the streets of our imagination, dressed in comprehensible flesh. In this, he becomes the bridge between the incomprehensible and the familiar, a walking metaphor for modernity's paradox. In a world ruled by abstraction, he is concreteness itself. But this concreteness is deceptive, for it conceals infinite regression beneath its skin. It is not merely that he represents chaos. He is the form chaos takes when it desires to be understood. If Nyarlathotep is unique among Lovecraft's pantheon, for his ability to speak, then it follows that his interaction with humanity is also singular, defined not by brute confrontation, but by communication that corrodes. He does not crash through cities like Cthulhu, nor dissolve identity through proximity like Yog-Sothoth. Instead, he whispers, he lectures, he demonstrates. His madness is not imposed, but understood. Unlike the other outer gods, whose alienness evokes awe and terror through sheer scale, Nyarlathotep interacts on the level of intellect. He reaches into the mind through cognition itself, bypassing superstition and entering through reason. This is why his victims are often thinkers, dreamers, scientists, those who seek truth not through worship, but through knowledge. In Lovecraft's cosmology, this is the ultimate vulnerability, and Nyarlathotep exploits it with precision. Consider the nature of madness in the original prose poem, Nyarlathotep, 1920, where the narrator describes witnessing the god's exhibitions. There was a hideous commotion. Men screamed and struggled, but we were not afraid, for we knew that we were dreaming. The line is subtle, almost dismissive, but it reveals everything. Fear has been replaced not with calm, but with the certainty of illusion. Yet this illusion offers no escape. The crowd does not panic out of terror, but collapses from the collapse of categories, awake or asleep, real or unreal, self or other. Nyarlathotep's effect on the mind is not a rupture, but a slow inversion, where one's conceptual framework begins to turn against itself. This is not hysteria. It is epistemological implosion. The result is madness not as a scream, but as a silence, one that can no longer trust what the scream means. We must recognize that this type of madness is fundamentally different from what one finds in Gothic or supernatural horror. In The Shining, Jack Torrance loses his mind through isolation and familial pressure. In Dracula, Lucy Westenra succumbs to a vampire's influence. These are intrusions upon the psyche. Nyarlathotep, however, does not intrude. He invites the mind to dismantle itself by offering information it cannot ethically or logically absorb. In The Dreams in the Witch House, Walter Gilman is seduced not by ritual, but by math. His descent begins not with cultic symbols, but with hypergeometry, proof that what we call reality is merely one interpretation of space. The presence of Nyarlathotep in this context is indirect but palpable. He moves not through overt possession, but through revelation. The equation is the incantation. The diagram is the trap. And the mind, believing it can handle more, becomes the site of its own erasure. The madness Nyarlathotep generates, then, is a function of human aspiration. This is the horror, that madness comes not from below, but from above, from our loftiest efforts to understand the cosmos. In this, Lovecraft reverses the traditional myth of forbidden knowledge. In Faustian tales, knowledge is punished because it trespasses on divine territory. But in Lovecraft's work, there is no divine territory, only empty structure. Nyarlathotep punishes not because humans reach too high, but because what they reach for is not what they expected. Consider the figure of Robert Blake in The Haunter of the Dark. He is not immoral. He is not even foolish. He is merely curious. And for that curiosity, he encounters Nyarlathotep, not in form, but in function, through the shining trapezohedron. His mind is not consumed. It is clarified to death. What makes this horror enduring is that it is recursive. Those who encounter Nyarlathotep are not destroyed in one stroke, but unmade in layers. Sanity erodes like sediment, each new revelation dissolving another assumption about reality. This process is most clearly dramatized in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, where Randolph Carter is lured ever deeper into dream realms under Nyarlathotep's manipulation. Each step promises insight, but leads further from the self. By the time Carter meets Nyarlathotep face to face, he no longer remembers whether he is awake or dreaming, alive or dead, real or imagined. His madness is not dramatized with violent breakdown, but with the erosion of identity. He does not scream, he disperses. This suggests a terrifying philosophical implication, that the self is not destroyed by external horror, but by internal clarity. When it finally understands that it was never stable to begin with, we must pause here and ask what role choice plays in these encounters. Are Nyarlathotep's victims chosen, or do they choose themselves? Lovecraft never answers this directly, but his Narratives suggest a pattern. It is always the seeker, the intellectual, the skeptic who encounters the god. In The Whisperer in Darkness, the protagonist receives letters warning him not to investigate, but he persists. In The Haunter of the Dark, Blake opens the window. In The Dreams in the Witch House, Gilman studies the angles. In each case, madness is not inflicted, it is unlocked. Nyarlathotep does not force his way into the mind. He opens the door that was already ajar. This reveals something deeply unsettling about Lovecraft's view of the human condition. That madness is not a break from reality, but the ultimate form of awareness, an awareness that reason cannot survive. In the final analysis, Nyarlathotep does not represent insanity as a disease, but as a stage of philosophical evolution. Those who truly understand him do not descend into madness. They arrive at it. They graduate into it. This is the final inversion. Madness, in Lovecraft's conception, is not a failure of the mind. It is its culmination. A mind that truly sees the universe as it is, chaotic, indifferent, infinite, must either be shattered or transformed into something unrecognizable. Nyarlathotep, therefore, is not the corrupter of thought. He is its last prophet. He does not lie. He only teaches, and what he teaches cannot be unlearned. In Lovecraft's mythos, knowledge is not power. It is not salvation. It is not even dangerous in the traditional sense. It is fatal. Not because it destroys the body, but because it dismantles the very framework through which the self understands existence. Of all his creations, Nyarlathotep is the most devastating in this regard. He is not merely the messenger of the outer gods. He is the transmission medium for knowledge that the human mind was never built to contain. His revelations do not offer secret keys to lost worlds or arcane formulas for mastery. They offer no exit. In this section, we turn from the psychological consequence of his revelations, madness, to the deeper, more disturbing layer, the nature of the content itself. What does Nyarlathotep show, tell, or awaken that causes cognition to fold inward? And more importantly, why is that knowledge always described in the passive voice? As if the act of learning is also the act of vanishing, the trope of forbidden knowledge in traditional literature often implies a transgression. Eve eating the fruit, Prometheus stealing fire, Faust making a pact. The knowledge is seductive and the punishment swift. But Lovecraft reframes this entirely. There is no deity forbidding knowledge because it is divine. There is only knowledge that, once perceived, demonstrates the absurdity of perception itself. In The Dreams in the Witch House, the equations Gilman studies do not open the door to enlightenment. They prove that time and space are illusions constructed by limited neural architecture. In The Haunter of the Dark, the shining trapezohedron does not contain dark power. It simply shows too much. Nyarlathotep, in every case, is the vector of this seeing. He does not obscure, he clarifies, and in doing so, he collapses the scaffolding of meaning that the human mind clings to. This is not a cautionary tale about arrogance. It is a philosophical assertion that to truly know is to cease being able to think. This dynamic is best understood through the concept of epistemic collapse, a term that refers to the breakdown of the systems we use to generate and evaluate knowledge. In Lovecraft's stories, epistemic collapse is dramatized through characters whose frameworks for reality are not challenged but invalidated. Nyarlathotep's demonstrations, dreams, and speeches do not argue. They overwrite. Consider his role in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadoth, where he reveals that the gods of Earth are nothing more than illusions conjured by desire. For Randolph Carter, this is not a moral revelation. It is ontological devastation. The object of his quest becomes meaningless in a single sentence. "They are gone," Nyarlathotep says, "and you may not find them." That sentence functions like a surgical incision. In it, Carter's quest is not resolved. It is erased. The collapse is not in the gods, but in the concept of quest itself. We must recognize that this form of collapse is not the same as ignorance. In traditional horror, the unknown remains a source of fear because it might be known. In Lovecraft, the horror is not that we don't know, but that we do, and that knowledge annihilates the knower. Nyarlathotep embodies this inversion. He is not the keeper of secrets. He is the absence of secrecy. He walks openly, speaks clearly, and yet those who listen fall into incoherence. This creates a paradox. He is both the most communicative and the most destructive of Lovecraft's entities. This is no accident. It suggests a truth more disturbing than silence. That language, when used precisely, can dismantle itself. He is not hiding the truth. He is showing that the very act of seeking truth is a self-defeating system. Once again, it is not deception, but demonstration that ruins. We must pause here and address the medium of this ruin, information itself. In a contemporary context, we might say that Nyarlathotep is not a god of secrets, but a god of signal overload. He does not withhold, he floods. He accelerates cognition to the point of collapse, showing that the mind, like any other organ, has a limit, a saturation point beyond which it cannot distinguish pattern from noise. In this way, Lovecraft anticipates modern anxieties about surveillance, media saturation, and data collapse. Nyarlathotep is the god not of what you were never meant to see, but of what you cannot stop seeing. He is recursive information, self-consuming signal, the sentence that decodes itself into static. In this, he is less like a teacher and more like a virus, one that replicates by making the host replicate him in thought. Consider carefully the nature of this infection. The knowledge Nyarlathotep offers does not spread through cult or scripture. It spreads through understanding. His cultists are not believers, but interpreters, those who have glimpsed his message and now speak in fragmented syntax, like damaged tape loops. In The Whisperer in Darkness, the protagonist receives coherent, reasoned letters that gradually deteriorate into mechanical parroting, speech that is shaped by grammar but no longer by selfhood. The speaker still speaks, but the words are not his. This dramatizes the ultimate horror of epistemic collapse. Not that thought ends, but that it continues without agency. Nyarlathotep does not silence his victims. He leaves them speaking until no one recognizes the voice. The collapse, then, is not into silence, but into noise that resembles meaning. Finally, we arrive at the most unthinkable implication, that Nyarlathotep's knowledge is not alien at all. It is human knowledge, taken to its endpoint. What he reveals is not that we are insignificant, but that we are trapped in systems of language, logic, and inquiry that, when followed to their limits, collapse under their own contradictions. He does not destroy these systems. He proves them correct. This is the cruelest irony of Lovecraft's vision. The more coherent Nyarlathotep's message, the less the mind can endure it. His speech is not a lie. It is an accurate map of a terrain that cannot be walked. He tells the truth. And in doing so, he makes all previous truths irrelevant. To trace the literary emergence of Nyarlathotep is to follow a trail of ink that begins not with lore, but with dream. Unlike other cosmic entities in Lovecraft's mythos, who are first introduced through mythology-laced exposition or secondhand reports, Nyarlathotep arrives unmediated. In a 1919 dream described by Lovecraft as so vivid that he awoke trembling. The result of this vision was the prose poem Nyarlathotep, 1920, a brief but potent document that contains within it the core of what Nyarlathotep would become, a walking revelation, a herald not of destruction, but of cognitive dissolution. This text is not simply the first mention of the name, it is the blueprint of narrative contamination. In just over 500 words, Lovecraft outlines a sequence of events that feels less like a story and more like a vision received, a prophecy whose origin cannot be verified, yet whose trajectory feels inevitable. In the poem, Nyarlathotep appears suddenly in human society. It was in the hot autumn that I went through the night with the restless crowds to see Nyarlathotep, the narrator begins, establishing not just place and time, but atmosphere, an oppressive urban malaise where something is wrong, though no one can say what. What follows is a demonstration of impossible machines, instruments which hummed and buzzed with delight, and a disintegration of collective experience. We saw that accursed thing which the late night held, and we knew that we had always known it. This recursive logic, seeing what one has always known, recognizing the alien as innate, becomes a hallmark of Nyarlathotep's presence in later texts. The poem ends with the collapse of space and sanity. And I screamed aloud that I was not afraid, that I never could be afraid, and others screamed with me for solace. This line, an inversion of reassurance, marks the epistemic horror we explored earlier. Fear not as a response, but as an axiom. Nyarlathotep next appears, indirectly but unmistakably, in The Crawling Chaos, written 1920, published 1921, a dream fragment co-authored with Winifred Five Jackson. While his name is never used, the title and tone suggest continuity. The narrator, under the influence of a drug of dreams, descends through a landscape of increasingly unstable perception, ultimately arriving at a pageant of horror unspeakable. Unlike Nyarlathotep, this story is more internal, more subjective, a dissolution of the self rather than society. Yet the mechanisms are similar: revelation through altered consciousness, recognition of an old truth, and a fall into narrative incoherence. It is not the god's presence that marks the story, but his signature, that distinct pattern of seduction through insight followed by collapse. Nyarlathotep, here unnamed, becomes an atmosphere, a metaphysical climate that infects the very act of narration. The clearest connection between these early appearances and Lovecraft's broader mythos comes in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, written 1926-27. Here, Nyarlathotep takes on a more defined narrative role as the antagonist of Randolph Carter, Lovecraft's recurring dream explorer and semi-autobiographical protagonist. In this story, Nyarlathotep is no longer an enigmatic prophet. He is a cosmic manipulator, the guardian of dream, the ruler of Kadath, and the one who thwarts Carter's search for the gods of Earth. His power is not physical, but narrative. He reshapes the logic of Carter's journey, looping his quest back upon itself, until Carter can no longer discern whether he is ascending toward truth or descending into illusion. "You are not waking," Nyarlathotep tells him, "but dreaming what you are, and your soul is in no proud city of the waking world, but in the fortress of the outer ones." With these words, Nyarlathotep articulates a metaphysical position that infects the entire mythos, that reality is recursive, and that the dreamer who wakes merely enters another dream. We must recognize that these early appearances are not unified by plot or cosmology, but by aesthetic function. Nyarlathotep is not a mythic figure who evolves through heroic epics or historical exposition. He evolves through repetition with variation. The same gestures, demonstration, revelation, collapse, repeated across different forms and contexts. In Fungi from Yugoth, Lovecraft's 36 sonnet sequence begun in 1929, Nyarlathotep appears again in fragments. In The Prophet, the narrator recounts visions of a man of darkness whose voice spoke of hidden things in language strange. The form shifts, but the mechanism remains. Knowledge that cannot be paraphrased, only suffered. It is important to note that Lovecraft rarely explains Nyarlathotep in exposition. Unlike Cthulhu, whose history and cult are narrated in detail in The Call of Cthulhu, 1928, or Azathoth, who is given a place in the cosmological hierarchy, Nyarlathotep is always seen, never summarized. His presence is an event, not a concept, and this is central to his mythic function. He is not an origin nor a conclusion, but an interruption, the moment when narrative coherence fails. Each early text featuring him ends not with resolution, but with silence, madness, or dream looping. This is not an accident. It is the literary enactment of his core principle, that knowing too much does not clarify. It dissolves. When Lovecraft composed The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, written between 1926 and 1927, though unpublished in his lifetime, he created what may be his most structurally ambitious and thematically intricate work, a dream epic that functions as both an exploration of cosmic wonder and a slow, devastating confrontation with the nature of forbidden knowledge. At its core is Randolph Carter, Lovecraft's alter ego and spiritual wanderer, who seeks the beautiful city of his dreams. But standing between Carter and the city's mystery is a figure who, unlike the other monstrous or dreamlike entities populating the story, speaks with clarity, intention, and, most terrifyingly, with a purpose Carter cannot anticipate. Nyarlathotep. His role in this text is not merely antagonistic, but ontological. He becomes the curator of cosmic limitation, a trickster architect who reveals not only Carter's misperceptions, but the existential futility of the quest itself. Nyarlathotep's presence in the narrative is deliberately deferred until the very end, a choice that imbues him with thematic gravity. When he does appear, it is not with fanfare, but with philosophical finality. "You have dreamed too well, O wise archdreamer," he tells Carter, "for you have drawn dreams gods cannot banish." This line is deceptively simple, but beneath it lies an epistemic collapse. Carter believes he has willed his dream city into existence. Nyarlathotep reveals instead that Carter's desire has merely created a trap, a recursive illusion from which there is no higher truth, no metaphysical beyond. The city is not salvation, it is stasis. Carter's quest, framed as an epic journey toward meaning, is instead an elaborate demonstration of its impossibility. We must recognize this as a profound narrative reversal. The hero's arrival does not resolve the story, it undoes it. Lovecraft uses the dreamland setting not to escape reality, but to interrogate it. Thus, dreamlands operate according to a surreal but consistent logic. Cats communicate, ghouls retain memory, and ancient cities exist on the brink of oblivion. Within this landscape, Nyarlathotep is not merely a disruptive presence. He is the organizing absence, the force that ensures no system is ever complete, no truth ever safe. When Carter encounters him, it is not as an invader, but as an inevitability. "It is not strange," Nyarlathotep says, "that you are here. It is strange that you think you are not always here." This rhetorical sleight of hand destabilizes Carter's and the reader's sense of progression. What seemed like a journey was merely a spiral. What seemed like pursuit was always return. Consider the way Nyarlathotep operates in Dream Quest, not through force, but through redirection. At key junctures, Carter is led away from certain paths and drawn toward others, always with the sense that some unseen intelligence is manipulating events. It is only at the end that we understand, retroactively, that Nyarlathotep has been the orchestrator all along. This revelation recasts the entire narrative in a more sinister light. The vast scope of Carter's dream journey, his encounters with the Zoogs, the moon beasts, the ghouls, and the gods of Kadath, are not milestones of growth, but elements in a theatrical performance designed to expose the poverty of desire. The dreamer does not ascend. He has shown the circularity of his dreaming, the futility of mythic seeking in a world where myth is no longer an avenue to truth, but a symptom of delusion. In this sense, Nyarlathotep functions as the anti-Virgil, guiding the dreamer not to divine insight, but to cosmic closure. It is essential to note that Lovecraft does not frame Nyarlathotep as evil. There is no malice in his final revelation to Carter. In fact, he seems almost admiring of Carter's ability to construct a dream so persistent that even the gods could not dissolve it. This tone, part condescending, part respectful, reinforces the idea that Nyarlathotep is not punishing Carter, but teaching him. And what he teaches is devastating, that the desire for a permanent home, a final truth, a sublime beauty, is itself the most persistent illusion of all. In this, Nyarlathotep emerges as a kind of dark Socrates, not tearing down illusions with rhetoric, but with ontological truth. He is not the destroyer of Carter's dream. He is the one who proves that the dream is all there ever was. We must pause here and recognize how Dream Quest advances the philosophical project of Nyarlathotep beyond earlier texts. In the prose poem Nyarlathotep, the god is a prophet of cultural ruin. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, he becomes a cosmic philosopher, a being who exposes the recursive futility of desire itself. The narrative arc does not simply end with Carter's enlightenment, nor with his madness. It ends with Carter's return to Earth, unchanged on the surface, but now, aware that what he longed for was only ever a reflection of his own mind. The implication is chilling. Nyarlathotep has not crushed him. He has made him understand. And in doing so, he has embedded within Carter, and within the reader, a new kind of awareness, that perhaps our entire lives are structured by longings for meanings that do not exist beyond the act of longing itself. If The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath presents Nyarlathotep as a manipulative architect within the dream world, then The Haunter of the Dark, 1936, returns him to something more intimate and far more unsettling, a whispering presence on Earth framed through urban decay, occult archaeology, and fatal curiosity. Written in Lovecraft's final year and published posthumously, The Haunter of the Dark is the culmination of decades of thematic refinement. It distills Nyarlathotep's terror into a single, symbolic object, the shining trapezohedron, and places it in the hands of Robert Blake, a writer and seeker whose final journal entries chart a descent not into violence or monstrosity, but into illumination. This story does not show Nyarlathotep in physical form. Rather, it allows us to witness what happens when a human mind opens a door and discovers that what lies beyond it is not merely alien, but waiting. The tale is told through layers of documentation, letters, journal entries, third-party news reports, providing a subtle narrative distance. Blake, a stand-in for Lovecraft himself in many respects, becomes obsessed with a ruined church on Federal Hill in Providence. Within it, he discovers remnants of a defunct cult known as the Church of Starry Wisdom, and, at its heart, a black stone artifact, the trapezohedron. It shone with a dark iridescent glow, Lovecraft writes, as if it were a window into deeper space. The stone, described with calculated vagueness, functions as a medium, both literal and symbolic, through which Nyarlathotep can cross the veil. Its power is activated not through ritual, but through sight. To look into it is to invite Nyarlathotep's attention. This act of perception, not summoning, is the true blasphemy. One sees and is seen. The being who emerges is called only the Haunter of the Dark. Yet Lovecraft's final line reveals his identity unambiguously. It is Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos. I am its sick priest. This dual identity, haunter and god, priest and prophet, encapsulates Lovecraft's growing emphasis on multiplicity. Nyarlathotep is not bound to a single form. He is the form adopted by the act of knowing itself. The Haunter does not physically harm Blake. Rather, its proximity drives him to fatal revelation. During a thunderstorm that causes a blackout across the city, Blake is found dead, clutching his journal, his last entry describing a glow of red light approaching through the window. What kills him is not violence. It is clarity. In darkness, when the technological defenses of the city fail, the eye of truth opens. And it is not merely divine, it is designed to be fatal. The narrative structure of the Haunter of the Dark reinforces this thematic precision. We are not given direct confrontation with Nyarlathotep. We are given the aftermath, the consequences of a mind reaching past the permissible limit. Blake's journal, increasingly fragmented and anxious, mirrors the slow unraveling of sanity in the face of metaphysical proximity. He is not attacked nor corrupted. He is informed. His notes shift from excitement to unease to a final, recursive panic, ending not in nonsense but in a sentence so clear it chills. I see it. I know it. Nyarlathotep. The horror here is not delusion. It is lucidity. Blake becomes, in his final moments, a mirror of the trapezohedron, an aperture through which forbidden knowledge leaks into the world. We must recognize that this story marks a key evolution in Nyarlathotep's literary function. Earlier works like Nyarlathotep, 1920, presented him as a traveler and prophet. The dream quest of unknown Kadath expanded him into a cosmic manipulator. But in The Haunter of the Dark, he becomes a localized manifestation, not in the mythic past or the dreamland future, but in our world, in a specific building, in a city mapped in detail. Providence becomes a haunted epistemological landscape, its skyline marked not by ancient monuments but by a ruined church that remembers. This shift brings Nyarlathotep into the reader's space. He is no longer out there. He is here, and worse, he is patient. We must pause here and consider the symbolic weight of electricity, specifically light, as both protection and threshold. The Haunter cannot emerge in light. It waits for darkness. Yet the trapezohedron glows. It emits its own unholy illumination. This contradiction, light as both safety and invitation, echoes the broader philosophical contradiction Lovecraft instills in Nyarlathotep. He is the one who speaks, the one who reveals, the one who makes things clear. And yet, to be illuminated by him is to be erased. Blake dies not from what he sees, but from what is shown. His death is not the conclusion of a story, but the fulfillment of a theorem. And what that theorem demonstrates is brutal in its simplicity. Some knowledge does not require belief to be dangerous. It only requires exposure. The story ends not with resolution, but with recurrence. A reporter finds Blake's body. The storm has passed. The city resumes. But the stone remains. The church still stands. The god is not gone. This circular ending suggests that Nyarlathotep's role in the mythos is not to enact events, but to initiate loops, cycles of curiosity, discovery, and annihilation that repeat endlessly through individuals like Blake. He is not the conclusion of these stories. He is their recurrence. In The Haunter of the Dark, Lovecraft masterfully compresses his entire cosmological vision into a single location, a single object, and a single fatal gaze. And at the center of it all is a being who never lies. Though Lovecraft's personal mythology ceased evolving with his death in 1937, the entities he birthed, Nyarlathotep chief among them, did not. Instead, they were adopted, expanded, and transformed by a succession of collaborators, followers, and literary inheritors. Chief among these was August Derleth, Lovecraft's publisher, correspondent, and eventual posthumous mythographer. Yet, Derleth's vision of the mythos fundamentally restructured its philosophical underpinnings, importing a moral dualism and theological scaffolding that Lovecraft explicitly rejected. In Derleth's hands, Nyarlathotep became one of the evil deities, locked in an eternal struggle with the elder gods, a Manichaean revision that flattens Lovecraft's original nihilism into cosmic allegory. It is not merely a misreading, it is an ontological betrayal. Nyarlathotep is no longer entropy incarnate, but a villainous agent in a war of good and evil, a distortion that, while commercially successful, diminished the epistemic horror at the core of the original design. We must recognize, however, that Nyarlathotep's structure, fluid, mobile, protean, allowed him to survive this reinterpretation in ways other mythos entities could not. His multiplicity of forms made him uniquely suited to evolve beyond Derleth's framework, and modern writers quickly reclaimed him as a symbol of philosophical disintegration rather than cosmic evil. In the works of Ramsey Campbell, for example, Nyarlathotep appears as a formless manipulator who haunts the modern psyche, rather than ancient ruins. In Campbell's Cold Print, 1985, the god's influence is channeled not through cults, but through literature itself, suggesting that stories, once written, become sites of summoning. This meta-literary frame returns Nyarlathotep to his most Lovecraftian function, not as antagonist, but as narrative contaminant. He is not summoned, he is read, and in being read, he reads you. This recursive function is even more evident in the writings of Thomas Ligotti, often described as Lovecraft's philosophical heir. Though Ligotti rarely uses mythos names directly, his horror echoes Nyarlathotep's conceptual legacy. In The Shadow at the Bottom of the World and The Last Feast of Harlequin, Ligotti conjures figures that are not simply monstrous, but symbolic of consciousness eroding under the weight of metaphysical insight. These figures are, if not Nyarlathotep himself, then unmistakably of him. They perform the same function, undoing the distinction between perception and reality, between self and world. Ligotti's horror is often silent and slow, but it functions precisely as Nyarlathotep does, through revelation that cannot be integrated. In this way, Nyarlathotep survives not by being invoked, but by being echoed, haunting not texts but structures of thought. The god's presence also persists in more overt experimental forms. In Alan Moore's Providence, 2015-2017, a graphic novel that blends Lovecraftian horror with metafictional critique, Nyarlathotep appears as Johnny Carcosa, a hypnotist and dream traveler who erodes the protagonist's sense of narrative stability. Moore, deeply aware of Lovecraft's symbolic strategies, uses Nyarlathotep as an embodiment of both literary and psychological entropy. Carcosa does not merely speak riddles. He destabilizes the panel structure, disrupts visual continuity, and addresses the reader directly. This literal breaking of the fourth wall is not a gimmick. It is Nyarlathotep's oldest function retooled for a postmodern medium, to remind the observer that they are never safe from the message, and that the message is the medium itself. The collapse of boundary between character and reader, text and metatext, is merely a new mask on an old face. In games, films, and digital subcultures, Nyarlathotep has taken on new forms. In video games like Bloodborne, 2015, and Call of Cthulhu, 2018, his name may be altered or hidden, but his essence remains intact, an entity who offers truth as a weapon, clarity as corruption. His role in these narratives often centers around knowledge-based progression, wherein the player's understanding of the world becomes the primary threat to their stability. These interactive forms preserve Lovecraft's core insight. That horror is not experienced passively, but is the result of a seeker's own desire to know too much. The interface between player and God becomes the new trapezohedron, lit screen instead of glowing stone. Perhaps most intriguing, however, is Nyarlathotep's mutation in internet culture and speculative philosophy. On message boards, in ARGs, alternate reality games, and in online forums, Nyarlathotep is referenced not as character, but as idea virus, a being who spreads through language, images, and cryptic symbols. The figure appears in creepypasta, liminal horror threads, and backroom-themed media. He is less named and more felt, surfacing wherever reality's seams begin to fray. His adaptability in these contexts mirrors how modern information spreads, not through belief systems, but through networks, algorithms, and semiotic resonance. In this sense, Nyarlathotep has become not merely a god of chaos, but a god of signal transmission, thriving in a world where meaning itself has become unstable. We must conclude that while Lovecraft died, Nyarlathotep did not. He persists because his function, cognitive disruption, philosophical ruin, recursive knowledge, remains relevant in every new cultural form. He is not a figure bound to a mythos, nor even to horror fiction. He is a narrative structure, a symbolic operator, a philosophical principle in the shape of a god. Writers will continue to revive him, not because they believe in him, but because they recognize what he represents. The moment when understanding turns to dread, and when explanation no longer explains. He is the idea that stories cannot contain ideas, and in every age that tries to construct coherence, Nyarlathotep will walk again, wearing whatever mask the moment demands. Though Nyarlathotep emerged from the imagination of H.P. Lovecraft, his afterlife increasingly resembles that of a real folkloric figure, transmitted through oral culture, internet mythology, urban legends, and experiential belief. Unlike Cthulhu or Azathoth, whose monstrousness feels bound to distant planets or sunken ruins, Nyarlathotep's essence, his walking presence, makes him uniquely suited for reabsorption into modern paranoia. He is not simply a literary device. He is an encounterable phenomenon. In the decades since Lovecraft's death, there have been scattered accounts, hoaxes, testimonies, ARGs, and speculative fictions, all describing faceless men, whispering wanderers, dream figures in suits and cloaks, often named or implied to be Nyarlathotep. And while no one believes these stories in the empirical sense, they persist because they function like folklore, fragments of narrative, traded in late-night forums and chat logs that warn not of what is but of what cannot be named safely. Consider the recurring figure of the Black Man, appearing in both Puritan witch trial testimonies and modern paranormal reports. In colonial Salem, this figure was believed to walk among the woods and offer knowledge or promises in exchange for signatures in a book. This Black Man reappears in The Dreams in the Witch House, explicitly identified as a mask of Nyarlathotep. But even beyond Lovecraft's fiction, this archetype lingers. In rural New England and Appalachian folklore, strange visitors, well-dressed, silent, always appearing before disaster, form part of a persistent American mythology. The phenomenon of men in black, popularized in UFO lore, overlaps disturbingly with Nyarlathotep's patterns, humanoid but uncanny, always offering information, always destabilizing the encounter. We must recognize this not as proof of a supernatural being, but as proof of a narrative structure, one that repeats because it satisfies a psychological need to externalize the fear that reality itself may be compromised. The rise of the internet has only accelerated this transformation. On sites like Reddit's Osh No Sleep and various 4chan boards, users share personal stories of dream visitations, glitch in the matrix events, or digital hauntings. While many are fiction, the line between storytelling and belief blurs in these communities. A recurring motif is the nameless guide, someone who appears in dreams, or at the edge of waking life, and shows the user something they should not have seen. Often the stories end with madness, silence, or the implication that the narrator is no longer writing as themselves. These stories rarely cite Nyarlathotep by name, but the narrative fingerprint is unmistakable. The presence who teaches, who speaks, and who ruins. He does not need to be identified to function. Indeed, not naming him is part of the ritual. He thrives in the anonymous. Alternate reality games, ARGs, have also embraced the myth in fragmented form. One of the most compelling examples is the infamous interface arc in the Everyman, hybrid YouTube series, part horror, part performance art, part metafiction. A being known only through glitching audio and cryptic symbols manipulates the narrative across multiple platforms, its goals unknowable, its methods linguistic and psychological. Players report a sense of being watched by the game itself. Another example, the Local 58 series, created by Chris Straub, which mimics broadcast television and emergency signal aesthetics. Its episodes contain messages from cosmic or metaphysical entities using media itself as conduit, an echo of Nyarlathotep's ancient role updated for the information age. These stories do not offer monsters to defeat. They offer frameworks that collapse. That is Nyarlathotep's true form. We must pause and ask, why does Nyarlathotep, more than any other Lovecraftian entity, persist in these modern mythic fragments? Part of the answer lies in his proximity. He does not sleep beneath oceans or dwell in the blind heart of chaos. He walks here, now. He is not defined by geography, but by encounter. In this, he echoes the most primal function of myth, to account for the inexplicable moment. When something irrational occurs, when dreams bleed into waking life, when signals misfire, when cognition flickers, Nyarlathotep offers a name for the thing that spoke when no one was there. It is not that people believe in him. It is that his pattern fits. And that pattern, truth, recognition, collapse, finds fertile ground in a world increasingly defined by semiotic overload and digital unreality. Furthermore, we must consider the idea that Nyarlathotep is not merely a character adapted into urban legend, but a figure whose design anticipates such migration. Lovecraft created him to walk among us. He gave him no fixed form. He gave him the power of speech. He made him charming, intelligent, patient. He made him ideal for belief without belief. Unlike other monsters who demand fear or worship, Nyarlathotep demands only attention. And attention is currency in the modern world. Stories that summon him need no altar, only bandwidth. If Nyarlathotep is a god of transmission, of messages that destroy meaning and truths that consume the speaker, then it follows that his afterlife would not remain confined to fiction. He is, above all, a medium-driven entity, one whose influence spreads through sound, image, and symbol rather than cult or command. As popular culture evolved into more sensory and immersive formats, particularly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Nyarlathotep found a new set of masks to wear. He is not often named directly in mainstream media, but his signature, his function, is everywhere. In films that undo perception, in games where knowledge becomes poison, in music that functions less as entertainment than as ritual. These are not mere tributes to Lovecraft. They are modern instantiations of his most transmissible god. Nyarlathotep has become the form art takes when it wants to say something it shouldn't. In cinema, Nyarlathotep's presence is rarely literal, but his influence saturates key films that blur reality, destabilize identity, and use knowledge as the mechanism of horror. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, stands as a particularly potent example. Though the film never uses Lovecraft's pantheon by name, it constructs a meta-horror narrative around an author whose books drive readers mad, opening gateways to cosmic forces beyond comprehension. The central antagonist, Sutter Kane, functions as an avatar of Nyarlathotep. He speaks clearly, writes compulsively, and reveals that fiction is indistinguishable from reality. Did I ever tell you my favorite color is blue? Kane asks, moments before the world literally shifts hue. This act of total narrative control, where perception obeys language, is precisely Nyarlathotep's method. He is not a monster that chases. He is the god that writes you in. Another filmic parallel appears in Alex Garland's Annihilation, 2018, where an alien intelligence, never personified, never named, interacts with humans by mirroring, fragmenting, and ultimately rewriting their biology and psychology. The protagonist, upon entering the alien zone, is slowly undone not by violence but by comprehension. She sees too clearly, she recognizes the structure, and it changes her. This is Nyarlathotep without a face, a force that teaches not by telling, but by transforming the knower. Likewise, in David Lynch's Inland Empire, 2006, a film already haunted by recursive storytelling and dream logic, characters are guided by figures that appear friendly, yet whose words erode the protagonist's boundaries between performance and personhood. These cinematic spaces operate as rituals, not plots. Viewers do not watch Nyarlathotep, they participate in his medium. The video game medium, interactive, non-linear, and often reliant on player perception, has proven particularly fertile ground for Nyarlathotepian horror. In Bloodborne, 2015, for instance, the game's central mechanic is revelation as damage. The more insight the player accumulates, a stat that represents exposure to forbidden knowledge, the more horrific the world becomes. Initially invisible monsters become visible. Sounds that were background noise become whispers. The landscape literally reconfigures. This mechanic is a perfect simulation of Nyarlathotep's doctrine. Knowledge is not redemptive. It is a corrosive agent that alters the subject. Importantly, the more insight you gain, the more you see what was already there. This reveals something profound. Perception was never reliable. You were not discovering the truth. You were uncovering your own blindness. Other games carry this logic forward. In Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, the protagonist's sanity meter fluctuates based on what is seen or understood. Madness is not cinematic flair, it is mechanical feedback. Doors disappear, enemies distort, dialogue scrambles. The game is not unwinnable, but the victory is hollow. You succeed not by resisting madness, but by managing it. This echoes Lovecraft's deepest theme, that survival in a cosmic horror world is not a matter of strength, but of cognitive compromise. Nyarlathotep is the god of this compromise, not by attacking the player, but by making the system logical until it breaks. We must also acknowledge Nyarlathotep's influence in music, particularly in genres that blur art and ritual. Dark ambient and industrial musicians often invoke him not as subject, but as structure. Consider the works of the band Nihil Novi Sub Sol, or Nodens Ictus, which incorporate dissonant drones, ritualistic chants, and spoken word samples layered with reversed speech and static. These are not soundtracks. They are experiences, meant to be endured rather than enjoyed. The album, The Call of the Void, by Nod, for instance, is explicitly structured around the idea of mental disintegration through repetition. Lyrics are absent. Instead, we hear murmurs, mechanical breathing, and fragments of distorted scripture. This is not music as expression. It is music as contamination, sound arranged as a vector for something else. The artist ceases to be performer and becomes channel. In live performance, groups like Current 93 and Coil have performed what amount to sonic rituals, incorporating occult symbolism and linguistic instability into the very framework of their shows. These performances often reference Lovecraft obliquely, but the deeper reference is to Nyarlathotep's function. The creation of an experience that is cognitively unstable, aesthetically recursive, and metaphysically ambiguous. The audience is not told a story, they are pulled through a veil, and on the other side, clarity is no longer possible. We must recognize that in each of these mediums, film, games, music, Nyarlathotep's survival depends not on direct representation, but on structural mimicry. He is rarely named because to name him is to reduce him. Instead, he is invoked through design, recursive mechanics, ambiguous narration, soundscapes that break perception. He has become the god of medium-conscious horror, one whose greatest power is not to appear, but to frame the experience of appearance itself. This allows him to remain hidden in plain sight, not as a monster, but as a principle of unmaking dressed in design. If Lovecraft intended Nyarlathotep to be the messenger of cosmic indifference, modernity has embraced him as something more complex, less a god of doom than a symbolic agent of ambiguity, recursion, and cognitive instability. While the previous subsection examined artistic and experiential invocations, we must now turn to the discursive realm. The appropriation of Nyarlathotep within subcultures, intellectual theory, and academic frameworks. Strikingly, the god who once served to unravel the sanity of fictional protagonists now appears in the language of cultural criticism, speculative philosophy, online identity construction, and even post-structuralist theory. These appropriations do not tame Nyarlathotep, they proliferate him. Every recontextualization acts as another mask, another incarnation. And in this multiplicity, his influence deepens, not as fiction, but as form. Among occult subcultures and esoteric movements, particularly those influenced by chaos magic, Nyarlathotep has been adopted not merely as a literary symbol, but as an actual working archetype. Modern grimoires, such as the Necronomicon Gnosis, 2006, and writings from the Temple of the Black Light or Dragon Rouge invoke Nyarlathotep as a communicative trickster spirit, one who reveals hidden systems only to corrupt them. Unlike traditional gods, he is approached not for stability or insight, but for disruption. Ritualists seeking altered states often frame Nyarlathotep as a being who distorts synchronicities, bends symbolic logic, and destabilizes linear causality. In this frame, he is not the adversary of order, but its saboteur, called upon precisely when language and ritual themselves are breaking down. It is not belief that sustains him, but function. He is summoned by need, not faith. Within digital subcultures, particularly those that operate on the liminal edges of performance, horror, and irony, Nyarlathotep appears as a mimetic ghost. One sees this most clearly in weird web communities and image board cultures, where references to Lovecraft's mythos are used not as homage, but as semiotic tools. A thread may begin with a cryptic reference, "He walks in flesh again," or "The thousand masks are online tonight," and spiral into recursive, often surreal narrative fragments. The language is playful, but charged. It is not simply fan fiction, it is performative invocation. The poster does not ask whether Nyarlathotep is real. They treat the idea as if it already has agency. In these corners of the internet, to write about Nyarlathotep is to test meaning itself, to see how long a sentence can hold coherence before it collapses into signal noise. This is not storytelling, it is simulation of unmaking. Academia, too, has begun to engage with Nyarlathotep, not always by name, but through frameworks he seems to inhabit. In media theory, particularly within discussions of hyperreality and post-structural instability, Nyarlathotep functions as an allegory for the destruction of the real through systems of communication. Jean Baudrillard's concept of the simulacrum, where representation precedes and determines reality, mirrors Nyarlathotep's logic. He does not point to truth. He generates the experience of truth, then renders it meaningless. Likewise, scholars of speculative realism and object-oriented ontology have turned to Lovecraftian entities as models for the unknowable object, the thing that cannot be grasped by anthropocentric systems of knowledge. Nyarlathotep, as a being who speaks but cannot be contained, emerges in these discourses as a symbol of the epistemic blind spot, the voice from the void that we keep trying to interpret, even as it undoes interpretation itself. We must pause here and consider a meta-commentary. What does it mean that a god originally designed to embody anti-meaning is now discussed meaningfully? Has he been domesticated, rendered safe through theory? The answer is not simple. On one hand, appropriation always runs the risk of neutering the horror. On the other, Nyarlathotep was always designed to be a contagion, not a creature. His spread across subcultural and academic landscapes may prove his function. He does not resist analysis. He triggers it, endlessly, recursively, without resolution. Each interpretation is another mask. Each framework built to understand him becomes, in turn, the thing he destabilizes. This reveals something profound. Nyarlathotep's true survival strategy is not to avoid being understood. It is to make understanding impossible to complete. The god has even found strange resonance in psychological and philosophical writing. Jungian analysts have identified Nyarlathotep as a type of shadow archetype, one who does not merely represent the repressed, but speaks on its behalf. More provocatively, some transpersonal psychologists have likened encounters with Nyarlathotep to experiences of ego dissolution during psychedelic states, the perception of a communicative presence that appears helpful, only to gradually reveal its message to be fatal to personal coherence. In this context, Nyarlathotep becomes less a monster and more a threshold event, the moment when the personality confronts the non-personal. It is not that he causes madness, it is that he reveals that madness was already the natural result of extended self-reflection. Finally, we must address his symbolic utility within identity politics and cultural studies. Some theorists have reframed Nyarlathotep as a post-colonial figure, particularly in his guise as the Black Pharaoh, a being who presents as both ancient and modern, authoritative and unstable. In this frame, he becomes a metaphor for the cultural other as simultaneously exoticized and feared. His ability to walk among us, to speak our language, and yet remain ultimately incomprehensible, mirrors the anxieties embedded in colonial narratives about the unknowable native, the charismatic threat. While this reading risks instrumentalizing the figure, it nonetheless underscores Nyarlathotep's elasticity. He can absorb critique as easily as myth. He can become whatever the discourse demands, which is, of course, exactly what he always was. The final legacy of Nyarlathotep lies not in pages or films or subcultures, but in a deeper place, one without architecture or audience. It resides within the psyche of the modern human being who has encountered, however abstractly, the idea that truth may be incompatible with survival. If Cthulhu represents the terror of a sleeping god who may one day awaken, Nyarlathotep is the reality of a god who never slept, who has always been here, speaking softly, endlessly, with a message that cannot be unheard. The psychological and philosophical implications of this are devastating, not because they are fantastical, but because they so closely echo what thinkers, skeptics, and seekers have long suspected: that consciousness itself may be the trap, and that what we call sanity is merely the refusal to know too much. At the most basic level, Nyarlathotep functions as a personification of cognitive disintegration. His method, speech, revelation, unmasking, is not violent in the traditional sense. It is informational. Those who go mad in Lovecraft's stories do so not from fear or shock, but from clarity. This maps closely to the real-world experiences of existential dread, derealization, and epistemic crisis. When one loses faith not in a belief system, but in the idea of belief itself, the resulting mental state resembles what Lovecraft called madness. Modern psychology has names for this: dissociation, nihilistic depression, even psychotic break. But Lovecraft's term captures something more essential. Not a disorder, but a kind of forbidden knowing. And Nyarlathotep is the vehicle of this knowing. He is not the destroyer of minds. He is the teacher of their limits. Philosophically, this ties into long-standing tensions in human inquiry. Plato warned of the cave, where shadows are mistaken for truth. Descartes feared the demon who deceives even our reasoning. Nietzsche declared the death of God and asked whether man could survive without myth. Nyarlathotep, in his purest form, is the answer to these fears. He is the one who confirms them. He tells the dreamer that the cave is real, that the demon is logic itself, and that God did not die, he never existed. In this sense, Nyarlathotep is not a fiction. He is the symbolic endpoint of philosophical skepticism. He does not argue, he demonstrates. And his demonstration is always the same, that the structure of the universe is not only indifferent to us, but fundamentally incompatible with the way we think. Reason is a localized aberration. Meaning is a side effect of perception. Selfhood is a recursive hallucination. He does not threaten these ideas. He embodies them. This raises an unsettling question. What kind of psyche survives such contact? If Nyarlathotep is the cognitive agent of entropy, information so precise it dissolves its container, then what does it mean to live in a world shaped by him? In this light, we might read the contemporary epidemic of anxiety, the rise of disinformation, and the breakdown of epistemic trust as secular forms of Lovecraftian horror. We no longer fear gods, we fear being wrong, and worse, we fear that no framework can correct us. In this context, Nyarlathotep is not an ancient being. He is the logic of collapse given personality. He does not attack. He sits inside the system, moving pieces, revealing flaws, waiting for you to understand. And when you do, it's already too late to explain to anyone else. The knowledge will not transfer. It was never meant to. We must also acknowledge how this idea infects the very project of selfhood. In stories like The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath and The Haunter of the Dark, the protagonists are not killed by Nyarlathotep. They are returned, but altered. Randolph Carter awakens from his journey, but the dream's logic lingers. Robert Blake dies, but with his final words, he becomes priest rather than victim. These are not defeats, they are transmissions. To encounter Nyarlathotep is to become a vector. The self does not disappear. It becomes rearranged, a looping structure of perception that cannot hold a stable center. This is why readers and thinkers alike keep returning to the figure. Not because he is dramatic or monstrous, but because he resembles the voice we already hear in the silence after too much reflection. And perhaps this is the most enduring implication, that Nyarlathotep is not merely a god of madness, but a mirror held up to modernity itself. In an era defined by information overload, by algorithmic manipulation, by recursive narratives and surveillance systems and breakdowns in shared meaning, he feels less like a myth and more like a description. He is the feeling that there is no floor beneath our feet, not because it was removed, but because it was never there. He is the suspicion that language can no longer stabilize experience. He is the whisper behind every headline that says, "Nothing is real," and every waking moment where the dream persists longer than it should. He is not the end of the world. He is the realization that the world may have ended already, and we just haven't caught up. In closing, let us resist the temptation to summarize. That would be, as always with Nyarlathotep, a mistake. He was never about conclusions. His message does not resolve, it loops. Like a voice on a shortwave frequency, repeating data in a language you almost recognize. Like a dream you didn't have, but somehow remember. Like a mask that, when removed, reveals your own face looking back. Slightly changed, slightly smiling. We began by asking what it means for a god to walk among us in disguise. We end by suspecting that he no longer wears one, and perhaps, just perhaps, he never did.